When a county clerk discovers something impossible in birth registries, the truth behind closed doors proves darker than anyone imagined. The ledger sat open on Thomas Harrington's desk, its yellowed pages covered in meticulous handwriting that had taken him 3 months to compile. As the newly appointed county clerk for Talbot County, Maryland, his first major task had been to organize and cross-reference all birth records from the past decade. The work was tedious but necessary. Property disputes, inheritance claims, and legal matters all depended on accurate documentation. It was past midnight when he noticed the pattern. 14 entries, all from the same location. 14 births between 1833 and 1836, every single one listed father unknown or simply left the paternal line blank. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. In his 5 years of clerking experience in Pennsylvania before moving south, he had never seen anything quite like this. 1 or 2 children born out of wedlock in a community was not unusual. Even 3 or 4 might raise eyebrows but could be explained. But 14, all from Millwood Estate. The name appeared again and again in his ledger, written in different hands by different registry officials over the years, but always the same location. The property belonged to Mrs. Catherine Vance, a widow who had inherited the estate upon her husband's death in 1832. According to the records, Millwood was a modest tobacco plantation with approximately 40 enslaved workers and 200 acres of cultivated land. Thomas traced his finger down the entries, noting the mother's names. All were listed as colored or Negro in the registry. The births themselves seemed medically normal, no unusual notations about complications or circumstances. But that absence of paternal information continued, line after line, year after year. He pulled out a separate ledger containing property tax records and death certificates. Jonathan Vance had died in March of 1832, cause of death listed as consumptive illness. He had been 47 years old. Catherine Vance, his widow, was recorded as 34 at the time of his passing. No children of their union were noted in any record. The first birth with no father listed appeared exactly 7 months after Jonathan Vance's death. Thomas felt a chill despite the warm summer night. He told himself he was being foolish, seeing patterns where none existed. There could be innocent explanations. Perhaps the estate simply did not keep proper records of unions among the enslaved population. Perhaps the registering officials had been lax in their duties. Perhaps. But 14 seemed excessive for mere carelessness. He needed to see the estate for himself. The July morning was already humid when Thomas set out on horseback toward Millwood Estate. He had informed his supervisor that he needed to verify some inconsistencies in the birth records, a routine matter that required an on-site visit. It was not unusual for clerks to travel to plantations and farms to correct documentation errors. As he rode along the dusty road, Thomas observed the countryside carefully. Talbot County was prosperous tobacco country, with large estates separated by miles of fields and woodland. The Chesapeake Bay lay to the west, providing transport for goods and connecting the region to Baltimore and beyond. It was old Maryland, where families had held their lands for generations, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Or so they thought. A local merchant had told him over breakfast that morning that Catherine Vance was considered an eccentric but respectable widow. She attended church services irregularly and rarely participated in social gatherings, but she paid her bills on time and caused no trouble. Her estate produced adequate tobacco yields, nothing spectacular but enough to maintain operations. She employed an overseer named Mr. Briggs, who handled the day-to-day management. Keeps to herself mostly, the merchant had said, wiping egg from his mustache. Some folks thought she might remarry after a proper mourning period, but she showed no interest. Told the Reverend's wife she preferred her independence. Thomas had asked casually if there had been any unusual occurrences at Millwood. The merchant had looked puzzled by the question. Unusual how? Any scandals, disputes, anything noteworthy? Not that I recall. Quiet place. Mrs. Vance runs a tight operation from what I hear. Yet quiet places, Thomas had learned, sometimes hid the loudest secrets. The entrance to Millwood Estate was marked by 2 stone pillars, weathered and covered in moss. A narrow lane led through tobacco fields, where enslaved workers moved between the rows, their songs carrying faintly on the breeze. The main house came into view after a quarter-mile, a 2-story Georgian structure with white columns and black shutters. It had seen better days. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and several shutters hung crooked on their hinges. A man emerged from the overseer's cottage as Thomas approached. He was in his 50s, thick-bodied and red-faced, with the permanent squint of someone who spent his days in bright sunlight. "Help you?" The question was not friendly. Thomas dismounted and introduced himself, producing his clerk's credentials. "I'm here on county business, verifying birth records. I need to speak with Mrs. Vance." The overseer, Mr. Briggs, looked skeptical. "Birth records? What's wrong with them?" "Nothing's wrong, sir. Just routine verification. Is Mrs. Vance available?" Briggs studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the main house. "Wait on the front porch. I'll see if she's receiving." Thomas tied his horse to a post and climbed the steps to the covered porch. The boards were solid beneath his feet, but the furniture looked worn. Through the window, he could see into a parlor that appeared dimly lit, despite the bright morning. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light. When the front door finally opened, Thomas found himself face to face with Catherine Vance. She was smaller than he had imagined, perhaps 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark hair pulled severely back from her face. Her dress was black, still in mourning colors 4 years after her husband's death. But it was her eyes that struck him, pale blue and unnervingly direct. "Mr. Harrington, Mr. Briggs says you're here about records." Her voice was low and measured, with the flat vowels of a Maryland native. "What kind of records?" "Birth registries, ma'am. May I come in?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then stepped aside. "The parlor, please." The interior of the house smelled of old wood and something else Thomas could not quite identify. Something vaguely medicinal. The parlor was indeed dark, lit by only 2 small windows. A portrait of a severe-looking man hung above the fireplace, presumably the late Mr. Vance. Catherine gestured to a chair and seated herself opposite him, her posture rigid. "What is the nature of your inquiry, Mr. Harrington?" Thomas opened his leather portfolio and withdrew his notes. "I've been compiling consolidated birth records for the county, and I've noticed some incomplete entries. Specifically, 14 births registered from this estate between 1833 and 1836, all lacking paternal information." He watched her face carefully. She did not flinch. "I fail to see the problem," she said evenly. "Enslaved persons do not always formalize their unions. Surely you're aware of that." "I am, ma'am. But 14 consecutive entries, all from the same location, all with the same omission. It's unusual enough to require clarification for the official record." "What clarification do you need?" "The identities of the fathers, if known." Catherine stood abruptly. "The fathers are not known to me, Mr. Harrington. I do not involve myself in the personal affairs of my workers beyond what is necessary for the operation of this estate. The children were born, they were registered as required by law, and that is the extent of my knowledge." Thomas remained seated, keeping his voice polite. "Mrs. Vance, I mean no disrespect, but on a plantation of this size, surely someone knows who the fathers are. Perhaps if I could speak with some of the mothers." "That will not be necessary. Ma'am, I have a legal obligation to complete these records, and I have a legal obligation to protect the privacy and dignity of the people under my care." Her voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Those children are healthy, they are documented, and their parentage is of no concern to anyone but themselves. Unless you have a court order compelling me to provide additional information, Mr. Harrington, I believe this interview is concluded." Thomas stood slowly, gathering his papers. He had pushed as far as he could without exceeding his authority. But Catherine Vance's defensiveness had only deepened his suspicion that something was wrong at Millwood Estate. "Thank you for your time, ma'am." I may need to return if my supervisors require additional documentation. You know where to find me." She did not walk him to the door. As Thomas mounted his horse and rode back down the lane, he glanced back at the house. A curtain in an upstairs window moved slightly, as if someone had been watching. The figure disappeared before he could make out any details. In the fields, the workers had stopped singing. Thomas spent the next 2 days discreetly asking questions in town. He learned that Millwood Estate purchased supplies regularly from local merchants, always paid in full, and seemed to operate without incident. No one reported unusual comings or goings. The enslaved population appeared adequately fed and housed by the standards of the time. There were no rumors of cruelty or abuse beyond the inherent cruelty of the system itself. But Thomas also learned that none of the local physicians had ever been called to Millwood for childbirth. This struck him as significant. Plantation owners, even those of modest means, typically employed doctors for difficult births, especially to protect their property interests in the enslaved children. Yet 14 births without a single recorded medical visit suggested either extraordinary luck or something else entirely. He found his answer from the wife of a local blacksmith, a gossipy woman who knew everyone's business. "Oh, Mrs. Vance uses old Dinah for all that," she said, leaning across the counter of her husband's shop. "Dinah's been the midwife at Millwood for 30 years or more. Delivered half the colored children in the county, I reckon. Skilled hands, they say. Does this Dinah live on the estate?" "She does. Has a cabin near the main house. Mrs. Vance trusts her completely from what I hear." Thomas felt he had found his next source. But approaching an enslaved woman on another person's property without permission was legally questionable and socially inflammatory. He needed to find Dinah away from Millwood. His opportunity came 3 days later, when he learned that Mrs. Vance would be attending a rare social obligation in the neighboring town, a funeral for a distant relation. Thomas waited until early evening, then rode back to Millwood Estate, this time entering through the woods on the eastern boundary rather than the main gate. The slave quarters consisted of a dozen small cabins arranged in 2 rows. As he approached on foot, leading his horse through the trees, he could see women preparing evening meals over outdoor fires, while children played in the dirt. Men were returning from the fields, tools over their shoulders. It was a scene he had witnessed at countless plantations, the mundane routine of an evil institution. Thomas tied his horse and approached the nearest cabin cautiously. An elderly woman sat on a 3-legged stool, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Her hair was white, her face deeply lined, but her hands moved with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I'm looking for Dinah." The woman's hands stopped moving. She looked up at him with clouded eyes that nevertheless seemed to see right through him. "Who's asking?" "My name is Thomas Harrington. I'm a county clerk. I need to speak with her about birth records." "Birth records?" The woman's voice was dry as autumn leaves. "Lots of births at Millwood. Are you Dinah?" "Might be, might not be. Depends on what you want." Thomas crouched down to be at her eye level, glancing around to ensure they were not observed. "I need to understand what's happening here. 14 children born in 3 years, no fathers listed. That's not natural oversight." Dinah resumed shelling peas, her gnarled fingers working automatically. For a long moment, Thomas thought she would not respond. Then, without looking at him, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You seem like a decent man. So I'll tell you this once. Leave Millwood alone. Go back to your office. Write down whatever you need to write, and forget you ever saw those names in your ledger." "I can't do that." "Then you're a fool." Her hands stopped again, and she turned to face him directly. "There are things in this world that clerks and records can't fix. Things that have their own logic, their own rules. Millwood is one of them." "What do you mean? What's happening with these children?" Dinah set down her bowl and leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "Those children are born healthy. They're cared for. Their mothers are protected. That's more than most can say in this terrible world. Why would you want to disturb that? Because the law requires—" "The law." The word dripped with bitter irony. "The law says I'm property. The law says those children are property. The law says a woman has no rights over her own body. And you want to talk to me about what the law requires? Thomas felt heat rise to his face. I understand your perspective, but you understand nothing, Mr. Harrington. Dinah stood, surprisingly spry for her apparent age. But I'll tell you this, because you seem determined to meddle. If you want the truth about Millwood, ask yourself one question. In 3 years, with 14 births, how many of those children look like Mr. Briggs? How many look like any man on this estate? Thomas frowned. I don't understand. Course you don't. She picked up her bowl of peas. Now get off this property before someone sees you and we both pay for your curiosity. She disappeared into her cabin, leaving Thomas standing alone in the gathering darkness. Her words echoed in his mind as he made his way back to his horse and rode toward town. How many of those children look like any man on this estate? What did that mean? Thomas could not let it go. Back in his office, he pulled out every record he could find related to Millwood Estate. Property deeds, tax assessments, crop yields, and, crucially, the marriage and death records of the county. Jonathan Vance had purchased Millwood Estate in 1820 with money inherited from his father. He had married Catherine Harper, daughter of a modest Baltimore merchant, in 1825. According to church records, they had lived quietly, attended services regularly, and were described as reserved but respectable by their pastor. There was no record of any children born to Catherine Vance in any county registry, no stillbirths, no infant deaths. After 12 years of marriage, the couple had remained childless. Then Jonathan Vance died in 1832, and 7 months later, the first birth with no father listed appeared in Thomas's ledger. Thomas created a timeline, writing carefully in his notebook. March 1832, Jonathan Vance dies. October 1832. First birth, mother named Ruth, no father listed February 1833. Second birth, mother named Sari, no father listed July 1833. Third birth, mother named Hannah, no father listed. The births continued, regularly spaced, approximately 3 to 4 per year. All the mothers were enslaved women at Millwood. All were between the ages of 17 and 32, based on the ages recorded at the time of birth. All the children survived, another statistical anomaly given the high infant mortality rates of the period. Thomas decided to take a more direct approach. He needed to see these children for himself. He returned to the blacksmith's wife and asked, with feigned casualness, whether any of the Millwood workers ever came to town. "Oh, certainly," she said. "Mrs. Vance sends them to fetch supplies sometimes. Very trusting of her, really. Some of the other plantation owners don't let their people go anywhere unsupervised." "When might I encounter them?" The woman thought for a moment. "Tuesday mornings, usually. A man named Peter comes to collect hardware orders, and I've seen the women at the general store on Wednesdays." On the following Wednesday, Thomas positioned himself near the general store, pretending to read a newspaper while watching the street. Just before noon, a small wagon arrived, driven by a young enslaved man. 3 women climbed down from the back, carrying baskets. One of them held a small child, perhaps 2 years old, on her hip. Thomas studied the child carefully. A girl with light brown skin and fine, straight hair that fell to her shoulders. Her features were delicate, her eyes the color of honey. As the women entered the store, Thomas followed at a discreet distance. The woman carrying the child set her down while she examined fabric. The girl played quietly near her mother's feet, humming to herself. Thomas crouched down near a barrel of flour, pretending to inspect it while observing the child. She glanced at him with curious eyes, then smiled shyly before hiding her face in her mother's skirt. She looked nothing like Mr. Briggs. The overseer was ruddy and rough-featured, with coarse hair and a broad nose. This child's features were refined, almost aristocratic in their delicacy. Thomas stood and approached the counter where the women were making their purchases. The shopkeeper tallied their items while making small talk. "How's everyone at Millwood, Ruth?" Ruth, the first name on Thomas's list. "Everyone's well, sir." Ruth replied quietly. Her voice was soft, almost musical. And this little one? The shopkeeper smiled at the child. She's growing like a weed. Yes, sir, she's healthy, thank the Lord, Thomas interjected carefully. Beautiful child. She has remarkable features. Ruth's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a guardedness entering her eyes. Thank you, sir. Takes after her mother, I suppose. Yes, sir. The answer came too quickly. The shopkeeper finished the transaction, and the women gathered their packages. As they left, Thomas caught Ruth's eye. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Fear, perhaps, or warning, or something else entirely. He watched them climb back into the wagon and depart. The child waved at him from her mother's lap, innocent and unaware of the questions her very existence raised. That afternoon, Thomas visited 2 more shops and managed to see 3 more of the children from his list. Each one shared the same characteristics: light skin, fine features, unusual grace, and each one looked nothing like the men Thomas had seen working in the fields at Millwood. But they did share certain similarities with each other. The shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth, the delicate bone structure. It was as if they all had the same father. Thomas knew he was approaching a truth that would be dangerous to uncover, but his conscience would not let him stop. He had been raised to believe in justice and truth, in the importance of law and order. What he had discovered at Millwood contradicted every principle he held dear, but he needed proof beyond his observations. He needed testimony, documentation, something concrete he could bring to the authorities. His opportunity came from an unexpected source. On a Saturday evening, as Thomas sat in his boarding house room reviewing his notes, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found a well-dressed Negro man standing in the hallway, hat in hand. Mr. Harrington, my name is Daniel Pierce. I was told you've been asking questions about Millwood Estate. Thomas ushered him inside quickly, glancing down the hallway to ensure no one had seen them. A white man receiving a Negro visitor in his private room would raise eyebrows even in Maryland. Daniel Pierce was a free man, as he explained, while Thomas poured them both coffee from his small stove. He worked as a carpenter in Baltimore and had come to Talbot County specifically to find Thomas. How did you know I was investigating Millwood? Thomas asked. Word travels in certain communities, Mr. Harrington. When a county clerk starts asking unusual questions about an estate and then starts watching who comes and goes from that estate, people notice. My sister works at the general store. She wrote to me. Why would she do that? Daniel set down his coffee cup carefully. Because my younger sister Hannah is at Millwood. She's one of the mothers in your records. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. You're here about Hannah? I'm here because I want to know what happened to her. 3 years ago, she was sold to Millwood Estate by a family in Baltimore who were settling debts. She was 17 years old. Before she left, I told her I was working to buy her freedom, that I had almost saved enough money. But you haven't been able to. Mrs. Vance won't sell. I've written letters, offered more than market value, even tried to visit. My requests are always denied. The last letter I received said Hannah was content in her situation and had no desire to leave. But I know my sister, Mr. Harrington. She would never choose to stay enslaved if freedom was an option. Thomas pulled out his ledger. Hannah is listed as the mother of a child born in July 1833. Is that correct? Daniel's jaw tightened. I received a letter informing me of the birth. No mention of a father. When I tried to visit, I was turned away at the gate by the overseer. Did Hannah ever write to you herself? Once, about 6 months after she arrived at Millwood. Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, worn from handling. She said she was being treated well, that Mrs. Vance was different from other owners, that she had nothing to complain about. But there was something strange about the letter, Mr. Harrington. The words were hers, but the tone wasn't. It felt rehearsed. Thomas read the letter carefully. It was indeed strange. The handwriting was neat, the language formal, almost stilted. It read like something written under supervision. May I keep this? Thomas asked. If it helps you find the truth. What do you think is happening at Millwood? Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. I don't know, but I know this. In 3 years, my sister has had 1 child and she's still there. Usually, once a woman has proven she can produce healthy children, she's either kept for breeding or sold at a higher price. But none of the women at Millwood are being sold. None of them are being moved. And according to what I've heard through other channels, all of them are protected. Protected how? Protected from Mr. Briggs. Protected from visiting traders. Protected from the usual violence and degradation that occurs on plantations. Daniel's voice was heavy with implication. Why would Mrs. Vance protect them, Mr. Harrington? What would she gain? Thomas had no answer, but the question crystallized something he had been thinking since his conversation with Dinah. The children were valuable to Catherine Vance for some reason beyond their economic worth as enslaved labor. I need to get onto that estate, Thomas said, properly with legal authority. I need to see the conditions, interview the mothers and document everything. How will you do that? I'll petition the county magistrate for an official inquiry. If I can demonstrate sufficient irregularity in the records, he'll have to authorize an inspection. Daniel stood. Do it quickly, Mr. Harrington. I don't know what's happening to my sister, but I know it's not right. And I know that the longer it continues, the harder it will be to stop. After Daniel left, Thomas sat at his desk until dawn, preparing his petition. He documented every irregularity, every pattern, every anomaly. He included the observations about the children's appearances, the protection of the mothers, the refusal to allow communication with outside relatives. He made a careful legal argument that the incomplete records represented a violation of county documentation requirements and potentially concealed more serious crimes. As the sun rose, he sealed his petition and prepared to submit it to Magistrate Roberts. He did not know that Catherine Vance had her own connections in the county, or that his petition would be delayed, or that events at Millwood would soon take a turn that would make all his careful documentation irrelevant. The delay in processing Thomas's petition proved frustratingly long. Magistrate Roberts was elderly and methodical, famous for his careful deliberation. Days turned into weeks while the petition sat on his desk, awaiting review. During this time, Thomas continued his own investigation. He traveled to the county seat and examined older records, looking for any prior mentions of Millwood Estate. He found property surveys, deed transfers, and crop reports, but nothing unusual except for one small notation in a record from 1830. The notation read, "Estate inspection conducted following neighbor complaint regarding unusual nighttime activities. No violations found." What unusual nighttime activities? The record did not elaborate. Thomas searched for the original complaint but could not locate it. Either it had been lost or deliberately removed from the files. He asked discreet questions of the county clerk who had preceded him, a man named Wallace, who had retired the previous year. Wallace lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town and spent his days fishing. Millwood Estate, Wallace had said when Thomas visited him one afternoon. "I remember the place. Quiet, always paid their fees on time. The widow took over after her husband died. Why do you ask?" "I'm reviewing the birth records. There are some inconsistencies." Wallace's expression shifted subtly. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Multiple births with no fathers listed." The old clerk was silent for a moment, staring at his fishing line where it disappeared into the slow-moving creek. "Son, let me give you some advice. Sometimes the best thing a clerk can do is keep accurate records and not ask too many questions. You document what you're told to document, you file what you're told to file, and you go home at night with a clear conscience because you did your job. But if something wrong is happening, wrong according to whom?" Wallace pulled up his fishing line, found it empty, and cast it again. "This is Maryland, Mr. Harrington. This is tobacco country. There are things that happen on every estate that would turn your stomach if you thought about them too hard. Your job is not to right every wrong. Your job is to keep records." "So you knew something was unusual about Millwood?" Wallace stood, gathering his fishing gear. "I knew that Mrs. Vance was a widow trying to run an estate on her own, that she kept her workers healthy and fed, and that she didn't cause trouble for anyone. That was enough for me. It should be enough for you. He left Thomas standing by the creek, his non-answer speaking volumes. Thomas returned to town that evening more determined than ever. If the previous clerk had deliberately overlooked something at Millwood, then Thomas had a duty to uncover it. But before he could take any further action, everything changed. The fire started just after midnight on a Tuesday, in early August. Thomas was awakened by the sound of church bells ringing frantically, the signal for emergency. He threw on his clothes and ran into the street, where he found townspeople rushing toward the eastern road. In the distance, an orange glow lit the night sky. "It's Millwood," someone shouted. "Millwood is burning." Thomas ran to the livery stable, saddled the quickest horse he could find, and rode toward the fire. The orange glow grew brighter as he approached, and he could smell smoke on the wind. By the time he reached the estate, dozens of people had already arrived. Neighbors, volunteer firefighters, curiosity seekers. The main house was engulfed in flames, the fire so intense that no one could approach within 50 yards. Thomas could see figures running back and forth carrying buckets from the well, but it was obviously futile. The house was beyond saving. He found Mr. Briggs near the overseer's cottage, his face blackened with soot, shouting orders that no one was following. The man looked panicked, disorganized. "Where's Mrs. Vance?" Thomas grabbed his arm. Briggs shook him off. "I don't know. She was in the house when it started. I tried to get to her, but the fire was too fast, too hot. Did she get out?" "I don't know." Briggs's voice cracked. I swear I tried, but the stairs were already burning and I couldn't." A woman's scream cut through the night. Thomas turned to see several enslaved women huddled together near the slave quarters, watching the house burn. One of them was Ruth, the young mother he had seen in town. She held her daughter close, the child's face buried in her mother's shoulder. Thomas approached them cautiously. "Did any of you see Mrs. Vance escape?" Ruth met his eyes, and in that moment, Thomas saw something he had not expected. Not fear, not grief, but something that looked almost like relief. "She didn't come out," Ruth said quietly. "The fire started in her chambers. By the time Mr. Briggs saw it, the whole upstairs was burning. How did it start? We don't know." But Ruth's expression suggested otherwise. The fire burned until dawn, consuming the main house completely. When the sun rose on the smoking ruins, a search party entered the remains carefully, looking for Mrs. Vance's body. They found her in what had been her bedroom, burned beyond recognition, but identified by the jewelry she wore, a wedding ring that had survived the heat. The county sheriff, a man named Edmund Porter, arrived mid-morning to investigate. Thomas watched as he interviewed Mr. Briggs, examined the ruins, and spoke with several of the enslaved workers. By early afternoon, Sheriff Porter had reached his conclusion. "Accidental fire, most likely," he announced to the gathered crowd, "probably started by a lamp or candle. The widow was alone in the house, no way to call for help. Tragic, but these things happen." Thomas could not stay silent. "Sheriff, shouldn't there be a more thorough investigation? There are irregularities connected to this estate that—" "What irregularities, Mr. Harrington?" Thomas explained quickly about the birth records, the missing paternal information, the unusual circumstances. Sheriff Porter listened with growing impatience. "So you're suggesting what? That someone deliberately set fire to the house because of birth records? I'm suggesting that there are questions that need answers. The only question I have, Mr. Harrington, is whether you have any evidence of a crime. Do you?" Thomas hesitated. He had observations, suspicions, patterns. But evidence? "Not yet, but—" "Then I suggest you let me do my job." Sheriff Porter turned away, dismissing him. Thomas spent the rest of the day at the estate, watching as the sheriff completed his investigation and as Mr. Briggs began making arrangements for the property. The estate would likely be sold to settle Mrs. Vance's debts, and the enslaved population would be sold along with it. This was standard practice when an owner died without heirs. But as Thomas prepared to leave that evening, Daniel Pierce appeared at his elbow, seemingly from nowhere. "We need to talk," Daniel said urgently. "Away from here." They rode to a clearing in the woods 1/2 mile from the estate. Daniel dismounted quickly, agitated. "My sister told me what happened," he said without preamble. "The real story." "What do you mean?" "The fire wasn't an accident, Mr. Harrington. It was set deliberately." Daniel's voice shook, "But not by who you think." Daniel paced in the clearing, struggling to compose himself. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. "Hannah got word to me this morning through one of the other workers," Daniel finally said. "She told me everything. She made me promise to tell you because she said you were the only person who had tried to help them." "Tell me what?" Daniel stopped pacing and faced Thomas directly. "Mrs. Vance started it, the whole thing. All 14 children." "I don't understand." "The children, Mr. Harrington. All 14 of them." Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're Mrs. Vance's children." Thomas felt the world tilt. "That's impossible. She couldn't have—" "Not impossible. Just hidden." Daniel sat down heavily on a fallen log. When Jonathan Vance died in 1832, he left his wife with a problem. Under Maryland law, if a married couple has no children and the husband dies, the wife keeps only a life interest in the property. After her death, the estate reverts to the husband's family. Catherine Vance would have been secure during her lifetime but left without true ownership and without heirs to inherit. But she could have remarried. She didn't want to remarry. Daniel's tone was bitter. She wanted to keep her independence and her estate, so she found another solution. Thomas sat down beside him, his mind racing. She bore children herself, but that would require... It would require concealing 14 pregnancies, Daniel said, which she did, very carefully. How is that even possible? Daniel pulled out a piece of paper, a letter in a woman's handwriting. "This is from Hannah. She wrote down what she knows, what she witnessed. She wanted you to have it." Thomas read the letter slowly, his hands shaking. According to Hannah's testimony, Catherine Vance had become pregnant in the summer of 1832, roughly 5 months after her husband's death. How she became pregnant was not Hannah's concern, but she suspected a traveling merchant who had visited the estate during that time. Mrs. Vance had realized her condition and made a desperate decision. She would hide her pregnancy and claim the child as the offspring of one of her enslaved workers. For the first pregnancy, she had confined herself to the house, claiming illness. She wore loose clothing and saw no visitors. When her time came, only Dinah, the midwife, was present. The child, a girl, was delivered in secret. Mrs. Vance nursed her for 3 months in her private chambers, then gave her to Ruth to raise as Ruth's own daughter. The birth was registered with no father listed, just another child born to an enslaved mother. But Catherine Vance had not stopped with one child. She had found a way to maintain her estate and her independence while producing heirs who could potentially inherit if she found a way to legitimize them later. Or perhaps she simply wanted children, having been denied them in her marriage. The letter did not speculate on her motivations. What it did describe was a pattern repeated 14 times. Catherine Vance would conceive, hide her pregnancy, deliver in secret with Dinah's help, and then place the child with one of the enslaved women to raise. The women were well treated, protected from the usual brutality of plantation life, given better food and housing in exchange for their participation in the deception. Ruth, Sari, Hannah, and the others were not the children's mothers. They were their nurses, their caregivers, their protectors. The children were all Catherine Vance's biological offspring. "Dear God," Thomas whispered when he finished reading. "But why would the women agree to this?" "Because they had no choice," Daniel said harshly. "But also because it was better than the alternative. Mrs. Vance protected them, Mr. Harrington. She protected them from Briggs, from other men, from being sold away from their children. In exchange, they kept her secret. And last night," Daniel's expression darkened. "According to Hannah, Mrs. Vance had become pregnant again, the 15th child. But this time something went wrong. She became ill during the pregnancy, very ill. Dinah told her she might not survive the birth. Mrs. Vance realized her secret was about to be exposed. If she died in childbirth, if a physician was called, the truth would come out. So she set the fire herself. Hannah thinks so. She thinks Mrs. Vance chose to die on her own terms rather than be exposed. The fire destroyed any evidence of her condition. She'll be buried as a respectable widow, and her secret dies with her. Thomas stood, walking to the edge of the clearing. The enormity of what he had learned was overwhelming. Catherine Vance had subverted every law and custom of her society, had used the institution of slavery to conceal her own scandal, had borne 14 children in complete secrecy. What about the fathers? Thomas asked. Who fathered these children? Daniel shrugged. Hannah doesn't know. Mrs. Vance never said. It might have been one man, might have been several. Whoever they were, they either didn't know they had children or chose not to acknowledge them. And the children? What will happen to them now? That's why I'm telling you all this. Daniel stood as well. The estate will be sold. Those 14 children will be sold as enslaved property because that's what the records say they are. They'll be separated from the only mothers they've known, sent to different plantations, probably never see each other again, unless we reveal the truth. And what would that accomplish? Daniel's voice was sharp. Even if you could prove they're Catherine Vance's biological children, which you can't, they were born to her out of wedlock. They have no legal rights. And the women who raised them, who kept them safe, would be punished for participating in the deception, maybe worse. Thomas paced in frustration. So we do nothing. We let them be sold as slaves when they're actually the children of a white woman. They're the children of an unmarried white woman, born in secret, with no proof of paternity, Daniel corrected. In the eyes of the law, they're nothing. But if we expose the truth, we endanger the women who protected them and gain nothing in return. Thomas knew he was right. The law offered no justice in this situation, only different forms of cruelty. What does Hannah want me to do? He asked finally. Daniel looked toward the distant ruins of Millwood. She wants you to complete the records as they stand. Register the birth of the child Mrs. Vance was carrying if she can be found. 14 children, all with mothers and no fathers listed, born between 1833 and 1836. Let that be the official story. And the truth? The truth is what you're holding in your hand. Daniel gestured to Hannah's letter. Keep it if you want. Burn it if you prefer. But don't try to change what's already recorded. Those children have survived this long because of the women who protected them. Don't undo that protection now. The body found in the ruins was indeed pregnant. The examination by the county physician confirmed it. Catherine Vance had been approximately 6 months along when she died. The physician noted it in his report with clinical detachment, then recommended the body be buried quickly due to its condition. No one in town seemed to know quite how to react to this revelation. Whispers spread quickly. The widow had been with child, but no husband, no known companion. Some speculated about secret liaisons, others about assault, still others about medical impossibilities. The scandal dominated conversation for weeks. But no one connected it to the 14 other children at Millwood, because no one had reason to look at those records except Thomas. He spent 3 days deciding what to do. He read Hannah's letter dozens of times, examined his own documentation, and wrestled with his conscience. Every principle he had been raised with demanded he expose the truth. But what truth? And to what end? Finally, he made his decision. Thomas completed the birth registry for Catherine Vance's unborn child, noting it as a miscarriage resulting from the mother's death. He listed no father. Then he closed the Millwood files and returned them to the county archives. The estate was sold at auction 6 weeks later. Mr. Briggs purchased it with funds from an unknown backer, becoming the new owner. The enslaved population, including the 14 children and their caretaker mothers, remained on the property rather than being sold separately. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Thomas learned from Daniel that Briggs had been approached by several of the mothers together, led by Ruth, and offered a proposal. They would continue to work the land and maintain the tobacco crops if he agreed to keep them and their children together and refrain from the violence that typically characterized his oversight. In exchange, they would tell him the secret they had kept for Catherine Vance. Briggs had agreed, reportedly shocked by what he learned. Whether from conscience or calculation, he honored the agreement. The women and children at Millwood remained together. Thomas never revealed what he had learned. He completed his term as county clerk, maintaining meticulous records, but asking no more questions about irregular entries. 2 years later, he accepted a position in Pennsylvania and left Maryland behind. But before he left, he did one small thing that nagged at his conscience. He visited Millwood one final time. It was autumn and the tobacco had been harvested. The fields lay empty, the soil dark and ready for winter. The slave quarters showed signs of improvement. Repaired roofs, new doors, a small vegetable garden. Mr. Briggs had apparently kept his word. Thomas found Ruth outside her cabin, hanging laundry to dry. The little girl who had waved at him from a wagon sat nearby, playing with a corn husk doll. She was 4 years old now, healthy and bright-eyed. Ruth saw him and went still. "Mr. Harrington, we thought you'd forgotten about us." "I couldn't forget," Thomas said quietly. "I wanted to see that you were safe. As safe as we can be." Ruth glanced at her daughter. "Mr. Briggs is not a good man, but he's better than some. He keeps his bargains. That's something. The girl, she's well cared for. All the children are well cared for. We make sure of that." Ruth paused, then asked the question that hung between them. "Did you record the truth in your papers?" "I recorded the facts as they were reported to me," Thomas said carefully. 14 births between 1833 and 1836, mothers known, fathers unknown. Ruth nodded slowly, understanding. "And Mrs. Vance?" "Died in a tragic fire. That's what the official record states." "That's all?" "That's all." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You're a strange man, Mr. Harrington. You came here looking for truth, and when you found it, you buried it." "Sometimes truth serves no one," Thomas replied. "Sometimes mercy is more important." "Maybe so." Ruth bent to pick up her daughter, settling her on her hip. "This one here, and the 13 others, they have a chance at life because of the women who protected them and the widow who bore them. Not a free life, not the life they deserve, but a life. If you'd exposed the secret, they'd have nothing." "I know." "Then why did you come back?" Thomas hesitated. "To remind myself why I made the choice I did. To see that it was the right choice." "Was it?" He looked at the little girl who smiled at him with those remarkable honey-colored eyes, innocent of the complexity of her origins and the secret that would follow her all her life. "I think so," Thomas said. "I hope so." He left Millwood that day and never returned. Years later, when Thomas Harrington was an old man living in Philadelphia, he would sometimes take out a worn leather folder from his desk and look at the documents inside. A letter from Hannah, a copy of the birth registries from Millwood Estate, and a list of 14 names. Ruth's daughter, Sarah Sary's son, Benjamin Hannah's daughter, Mary, and 11 others, each marked Father Unknown. He had followed their stories when he could, through correspondence and occasional newspapers from Maryland. Some had remained at Millwood their entire lives. Others had been sold when Briggs died in 1847, scattered to different estates across the South. A few had gained freedom after the war, taking new names and new lives. But they had survived. That was what mattered. Thomas never told anyone the full truth of what had happened at Millwood Estate. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, he considered revealing the story then, when it might matter. But what would it prove? That a desperate widow had subverted the law to produce heirs she could never claim. That 14 children had been born into slavery to protect their mother's secret. The truth would not free them. It would only expose the women who had protected them to judgment and shame. So Thomas kept his silence, just as Ruth and Hannah and Dinah and the others had kept theirs. The official record remained unchanged: 14 births at Millwood Estate between 1833 and 1836, all lacking paternal information, an irregularity, certainly, an anomaly worth noting, but not, in the end, a truth that anyone seemed eager to pursue. In 1873, a young historian named Margaret Hayes was researching family genealogies in Maryland and came across the Millwood Estate records in the county archives. She noticed the unusual pattern of births and wrote a short article about it for a historical journal, speculating about possible explanations. Her article proposed that the missing fathers might have been white men whose identities were protected by the plantation owners, a common practice in the antebellum South. She noted the unusually good health outcomes for both mothers and children and suggested that Millwood Estate might have been run more humanely than most plantations. The article attracted little attention. Most readers found it mildly interesting, but unremarkable. After all, there were countless mysteries in old records, countless missing names and incomplete stories. This was just one more. Margaret Hayes never learned the truth about Catherine Vance's secret. But her article preserved the names of the 14 children for history, ensuring they would not be completely forgotten. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all anyone could do: record the facts, preserve the names, and let the full truth remain buried with those who had lived it. The ledger still exists in the Maryland State Archives, if anyone cares to look. 14 entries, all from Millwood Estate, all listing mothers but no fathers. An administrative irregularity from 1836, curious, but ultimately unexplained. The truth lies in the spaces between the entries, in the silence of incomplete records, in the secrets that died with Catherine Vance in the fire that consumed her home. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, others are meant to be kept. The widow's secret remains both.